You have just read about project-based learning, or PBL. As you watch this video, keep the following questions in the back of your mind. What kind of project-based learning would my students find interesting? Which of the strategies reviewed would work in my classroom? Project-based learning is a hands-on teaching method in which students gain knowledge and skills by working for an extended period of time to investigate and respond to an engaging and complex question, problem, or challenge. In other words, it is a lot like asking your students to become detectives or even scientists who conduct research and experiments in order to find the answers to a quest that you've set for them. Project-based learning is a great way to help students retain information because it helps them connect the information they are learning to a fun and self-guided experience. Students feel personally invested in the project, and this in turn makes it more likely that students will learn more. Let's say you want to start implementing project-based learning in your classroom. Say you want students to learn about a civil war in your country. A good project-based learning exercise would be to have students create a fictional newspaper from the time period, complete with interviews with people who were alive during the war and hand-drawn depictions of key figures of locations involved in the war. When coming up with a project, be creative. Look for a project that will engage all of your learners, whether they gravitate towards art, nature, the written word, or social learning. Revisit your learning styles inventory and make sure there is something for everyone. Come up with a list of key things your students should be learning that align with your standard curriculum, specific dates or names that your students need to know, and make sure those are incorporated into the assignment. Finally, make sure the resources are available for your students in order to succeed. In this example, students will need paper and art supplies that they can use to create something resembling a newspaper. Once you figure out what your project should be, your next consideration will be, how do I present this to my students? The first thing you want to do is to come up with a good driving question. Driving questions guide the project, and it's important that students find them meaningful and important. Throughout the project, the teacher calls attention to the driving question to link together the various ideas students explore during the project. Good driving questions have several features. They should be feasible, in that students can design and perform investigations to answer the question. Worthwhile, in that they contain rich content that aligns with national or district standards and relates to actual experiences. Contextualized, in that they apply to the real world and are non-trivial and important. Meaningful, in that they are interesting and exciting to learners. And ethical, in that they do not harm anyone, organism, or the environment. So, in our example of the newspaper, a good driving question could be, what was life like on this specific date during the Civil War in our country, and why? What events, cultural influences, weather, or other things were influencing life on that day? In this driving question, students are asked to not only paint a picture of daily life, but to go more in depth to the key contributing factors and events, requiring them to do some higher-level analysis and research. Writing a fake newspaper can be a daunting task. It's best to break it down into smaller pieces and to come up with a series of artifacts or smaller pieces that students can put together at the end to create their newspaper. Artifacts are external representations of constructed knowledge. They help students focus on specific pieces of information that they can then tie back to the larger themes being studied. For example, an artifact in this scenario could be a list of questions that students develop alone or in groups as part of an interview they have to do with someone who lived during the Civil War. Knowing what questions to ask and what information is important in the context of the driving questions requires higher-level thinking and analysis. It helps students keep the big picture in mind, even when they are talking one-on-one with someone about their own personal experience during the war. And once the interview is completed, it will result in one or more pieces of information that will help students answer the driving question. As your students are working on their artifacts, make sure you see plenty of collaboration. This is a class-wide project, meaning your students will need to work independently on their various pieces, but also together in order to pull those pieces together. Students collaborate with others in their classroom and with their teacher to ask questions, write explanations, form conclusions, make sense of information, discuss data, and present findings. For example, you could ask students to critique and provide feedback for other students' interviews and written articles. Let's review. In this lesson, you saw an example of how to use project-based learning in your own classroom. You learned that when coming up with a project, you want to look for something that speaks to all the different learning styles of your students. Be creative and make sure your students can access all the resources they need in order to meet the project's requirements. Also, make sure that all of your required learning outcomes set by your school or country are touched on by the project. Next, come up with a good driving question. A driving question will keep students focused on the big picture ideas and connect all of the smaller parts of the project together. It will help keep students motivated and excited about the project and make sure they don't get too far off track. Be sure to remind students of the driving question periodically. Next, think about the different kinds of artifacts you want your students to create. Artifacts are something tangible that students create to show they have mastered the concept, and they help tie small details to the big picture. As students are working on the project, make sure you see plenty of collaboration as well as independent work. Remember, your students are learning life skills like leadership and teamwork just as much as they are learning about a specific topic. Now is a good time to answer those questions you were asked at the beginning of this video.